Welcome to the Open Door podcast. My name is Anthony.
And my name is Patrick. In this episode, we talked with Johnny. At 23 years old, he was the CEO of a national charity called the National Association of College and University Entrepreneurs. Now he serves as the governor of the University for the Creative Arts.
And in 2019, he campaigned for the Conservative seat at Hampstead and Kilburn. In this episode, we talked about his life in politics and competitive rowing, and how his identity within these areas was influenced.
This episode was recorded near the end of 2020, so try and keep that in mind if some of the things we say are a bit outdated. Also, we're experimenting with different episode lengths. So last week's episode was around 40 minutes, and you guys seem to respond pretty positively to that. So if you do prefer that to the 1 hour episodes we were previously doing, please let us know.
And finally, timestamps are in the description if you want to skip forward to any particular parts. But without any further delay, this is Johnny.
You've got quite a lot of experience with politics. How did you get into that?
Yeah, so I never originally planned to be anywhere near politics whatsoever. Didn't care about it. I studied a little bit of like international relations at university, but I never really focused on it. And I didn't join, the political groups at universities or, none of that stuff. I was firstly interested in public service. So that was my first step. I spent my last year at university volunteering to be a teacher. So I taught science part-time in a very, very amazing school in Durham, but it was a tough school. There was a lot of deprivation. I had to cycle like 45 minutes, try not to get run over by a car every day. Well, not every day, but regularly to go and teach. And I realized I live in a bubble, There's a lot of people out there that are struggling and we need to do something about it. I realized quickly that I sucked at teaching, but I did want to do the more macro level, larger scale reforms. So I joined the graduate scheme for the civil service. So that's my first step. So working in government. During that time, I had to go to Parliament a lot and do work there. And I met a guy called Jackson Ng, who was another British Chinese person who was involved in politics. He was an advisor for one of the House of Lords member, Lord Wei, who's one of the very few parliamentarians who's British Chinese in the UK. So, and then alongside Sheila McIntosh, another mentor of mine, they brought me in slowly into politics. And it starts small, attending some events. They founded something called the Conservative Friends of the Chinese, which is to promote the British Chinese viewpoint to parliamentarians. I got to meet politicians and I realized that they were just human beings like you and I. And I guess I'm very much drawn to the politics, not because of the brick throwing and the shouting matches, but because I feel like there's a community there of people that actually genuinely cares about their society and their country. And that kind of grew and grew, and I can tell you more about it. But basically, I ended up me running for parliament myself last year. So that's a really cool experience. And I'll carry that experience with me for a long time.
You mentioned before that you're a moderate conservative, right? Am I correct?
Yeah.
Can you tell us the evolution of your political journey? Were you always conservative or?
I wouldn't say I was necessarily political for a long time, but the only party I've ever joined is the Conservative Party. So I think my first conservative event was in 2013. I had to be quite cautious about because as a civil servant, you need to be politically neutral. Just kind of running back on the label moderate, I think the term moderate can be perceived very negatively, especially in a world where politics is very polarized. And what I want to be clear is that in some ways, I'm not a moderate, because a moderate can sometimes be really wishy-washy, status quo, just tick things along. I am not that person. I'm a radical in that sense. I want to break things, I want to make things happen. The difference, though, is that I don't live in this cuckoo land where the world is simple and easy and black and white. Having worked in government for several years, including on Brexit negotiations in Downing Street, life is gray, messy, and complicated. If there were things that we could have solved, for example, homelessness, improving education, removing poverty, if those were easy challenges, they would have already been solved, but they're not. And so I could argue that I'm like a pragmatist, but I'm also a compassionate conservative. I believe it's really important to improve things, but in a realistic way, not in a kind of like unrealistic way. And why I'm a conservative and not in let's say in the Labour Party, partly it's because of the people I met in that journey that kind of got me into the conservative camp. Like I've been to all three political party conferences. I've been to the Lib Dem, Labour and Conservative conferences because I used to run a charity and I had to go to all three. And I just don't find the culture in some of the other parties as inclusive, strangely, as the Tories. Well, in the Labour Party, I had the experience of feeling like I was constantly being judged. They had this kind of holier than thou attitude sometimes, and I find that quite off-putting. And of course, in the last general election, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and I found that horrendous. So I'm sure they're getting better at it now. But politically, the reason why I'm a conservative is I believe fundamentally that I don't want a big state. You know, having worked in the Whitehall, worked in the ivory tower of central government, I don't want an administration that will ultimately tell you what to do with your life. Now, of course, the pandemic has made that a little harder, and you can see the kickback, and that's understandable. But I know that's a short-term thing. And my principle is give individuals more control because they know how to live their lives. You know, within the parameters, of course, we need to have a health service, we need to have a defense, that kind of thing.
Can you elaborate a bit more about that? Like, how do you mean by give people control of their lives? Could you give an example?
Yeah, no. So, for example, government spending, we waste a lot of money. Like, it's just a fact. I remember working in the international trade department, and I was given a massive budget to organize a trade show across Europe on promoting tech and investment, stuff like that. And I underspent by a massive amount. And then I got dragged into a meeting and I thought I was going to get promoted because I was like, look at me, I'm a cost cutter, right? I got a freaking discipline because I was not spending all the money. They said, if I don't spend all the money, then next year our budget will be cut. This exemplifies the problem of government, where we are taking your money and we're burning it. We are literally burning it on crap that we don't need. So what did we end up doing? We had to take that money and we spend it on like some chefs to make a cool dinner for an investor. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's crazy. I don't think that happens now, but like certainly in my experience, that was horrendous. But like ultimately, we need to be more competitive. We're very heavily taxed and there's not enough transparency of how we use all that cash. And it affects all of us. So it's not just tax, but it's also regulation, the ability to feel like you have control in your own future, making sure that you have control over your community. You know, if you live up north and you're being told what to do in central London, I think people will be quite upset. The general principle though is like government should protect you, but you should be the owner of your own life.
Yeah, your definition of government is very intriguing. I think in the West, where it is seen as more individualistic in society compared to the East, obtaining more control over how one lives, I think, is seen more as a human rights priority here. The government shouldn't have too much dictate over you, but going back to politics in a broader definition. So George Orwell said that no book is free from political bias, and the opinion to have art be kept away from politics is in itself a political opinion. So in essence, you can never escape politics.
Yeah.
What do you make of this statement by Orwell, and do you have your own personal definition of politics?
The line has a lot of resonance to me because having been a civil servant as well, where you have to be politically neutral, you realize it's kind of impossible, right? Your job is to implement government policy. And so how can you be politically neutral? I mean, is politically neutral basically saying that you don't tweet it out, but you still have opinions? So yeah, I do understand that point. In terms of the definition of politics, I think the academic definition of politics is really dangerous. Like often politics seems to be condensed around like which camp are you in? Are you a liberal, in the axis, or are you left and right, or are you conservative or labor? I think that's the wrong question. I think the question is much more about, do you want to solve problems? And then how do we solve those problems? My belief is that most people are not straight left or right. They tend to have different pickets. I'm a social liberal. I'm a fiscal conservative. That's how I define myself. I'm a massive fighter for things like gay rights, diversity, inclusion, being more compassionate, lots more training and support for those who don't have the opportunities. I'm a fiscal conservative in terms of I'm naturally nervous about huge spending promises from people who don't necessarily have the ability to execute them. And that subtlety can't be captured if you're in the natural way of defining politics, which is that you're left or right. But it should be much more about, can you solve these problems? And sometimes you need radical thinking to solve the problems. Sometimes the system is working. We just got to make it better. Like the NHS. We don't need to scrap the NHS, but we got to make it better. And I find it frustrating when commentators go, oh, there's all these problems. Like a lot of people are moaning about, oh, vaccine distribution is going to be a disaster. I'm like, well, I don't want to just moan about it. I want to solve it. And I want politics to be much more about solving problems than about rhetoric. But it's been driven a lot by rhetoric, partly by social media, partly by how voters perceive things, and partly by echo chambers, because we don't want to listen to uncomfortable things these days. And that's a real problem. And we got to solve that too.
Yeah, I think I really resonate with what you just said there. I think political orientation is quite fluid. So most people, I would say, aren't just left or right. Like personally, there isn't one party that I 100% support, because I just don't agree with all of the policies. So it's quite difficult for me to vote sometimes, and it is quite unhelpful to me to put people under these labels and these camps, But people can be quite stubborn, in my experience. They'll continue to claim they support a particular party even when it clearly doesn't align with their beliefs anymore. But I also really agree with you being very skeptical of huge spending promises. Actually, just political manifestos in general, I have a really big problem with. Like, is this 100-page document, or over 100-page document, of just words and words, but zero references or sources or calculations to back up any of the claims or promises being made. So, for example, I think it was the 2017 general election, the Labour Party promised a lot of money to young people, like first-time buyers and stuff like that, which was very attractive. But I don't recall them saying where this money was suddenly going to come from. Or I think they might have said that they're going to put higher taxes on rich people, but there definitely weren't any calculations, not even rough calculations, to even suggest that this would be possible. Maybe what percentage of people are considered rich in this scenario, and how much they were going to tax them, how much on average they earn, and how much they expect to be able to get from these increased taxes, and how much of that they can give to fund or to support young people buying homes for the first time. There was none of that. They just said that they were going to give more money to first-time buyers. So if you did that in any sort of academic paper, you'd just be laughed out of your own field, But then there were also a lot of conservative policies that I didn't really agree with, so I didn't want to vote for, that party either. And I know it's not just those two, but those are the main ones, right? So yeah, I think what you said about needing more transparency on spending is also something I really agree with. And that's one of my biggest issues with current politics. But politics in general can be quite an awkward topic to bring up with, friends and family. Do you find that you have to avoid talking about it with your friends and family?
Yeah, for sure. I think, you know what? When I ran for parliament, up till that point, people knew kind of like, oh, you've done some things with the Conservative Party. To be then selected to run for parliament, you can no longer be shy about where you stand, right? And I was quite worried because, my sister used to vote for the Green Party, right? So to me, my mom was a trade union leader, right? So to me, I'm like, oh God. And then of course I had a lot of friends who are on different political trajectories. But what I found was that, my God, it's so liberating. It's so liberating to get off the fence and have an opinion. Why is it that so many other people on Twitter can moan about shit and I can't? It's so nice to be a person that can say their own opinion. And I found that as I got more confident in that and I got more confident with my arguments, I was able to convince people to join my side, or at least became more resilient. Because when someone criticizes me, I'm like, well, actually, I think you're wrong because of ABC, in a very respectful way. I did get a few hate mail. I even got, I think, a death threat. So it's pretty brutal. But I realized you got to tune it out. Overall, I think my family are very proud of my political positions because I'm a realist. I'm not a fantasist. I want to solve problems. And I have a lot of friends who are from the other political spectrum, and that's great. We need to talk to everybody, and their opinions are not necessarily wrong. They're smart people as well. So we got to learn from each other and solve problems together. I think we need more of that, not less of that. So I'm a very nice guy. Like I listen to everyone's opinion, and I think my position changes depending on specific policies as well. So, but no, overall, I think last year was particularly divisive. I think it's going to be less divisive, hopefully, in the future, in the next few years.
Are you ever worried that your political stance loses your friendships with people?
I would say my closer friends, they will not change in terms of their view of me because they know who I am. They know where I stand, not necessarily in politics, but in terms of like my viewpoint in life, in terms of the fact that I'm earnest, that I'm a hard worker, that I care about people. And like, that's the core narrative. And it doesn't matter then what label you slap on. Maybe newer friends. And there's a couple of people who I thought were friends, and they were like messaging me, wishing that I lose and that I'm a horrible person. I'm like, hold on. This is not a reflection of me. This is a reflection of your attitude in life and how nasty you are, but no, I think overall, like my support network is really, really, really strong. And politics is a long-term game. Most people will never be selected for parliament or run for parliament or win a seat. I still have those ambitions, but it's going to take me 5, 10, 15, 20 years. You build a lot of resilience in that journey. And if you believe strong enough that your values are right, and if they're not right, you should keep reflecting and correcting them, that it's about public service and making people's lives better, then people are drawn to that, right? People are drawn to those who have the energy and the willingness to make things happen. And I think if you're always sitting on the fence or if you're too cautious because you're scared you're offending people, the truth is everyone's going to get offended by something. If they're not offended by you, they'll be offended by something else. So it's a tough balancing act. And I'm still learning myself about what's the right or wrong opinion, which is why I always try and learn and be really clear about my position only after I learn the facts, and keep learning and unlearning as well.
What's your attitude to weaving your cultural identity into your political narrative?
That's a really big one. And I'm very proud to have recently joined a group called CARVE, and we basically stand for the Conservatives Against Racism for Equality. And one of the things that we've explored was, A, we need to have more diverse just politics, but B is there are ethnic minority MPs who are very reluctant to talk about race issues. And I 100% understand why, because you don't want to be typecasted. You don't want to be the race guy, right? In fact, I would say that sometimes there is a temptation to overcompensate the other way. So you're like trying to play up your non-ethnic minority credentials to compensate that, especially if you represent an area that isn't diverse. Maybe if I represented a very rural constituency, I would be a bit insecure, and I want to reassure people that like I'm a pub drinking, fish and chips guy, that kind of thing. And I get that. And so what's really important is that they have support and political cover from those who are not ethnic minorities to talk about race issues. And so it's not consigned to a specific group of MPs. It should be an issue for everybody. Behind the scenes, I've been a strong advocate of that. Like, let's look at something that isn't race, like let's say gender equality. It is so important for people like us who are men to support women in their journey of pay equality or discrimination in the workplace. It's a woman and man issue or anything in between. And to do that, we have to make the case. So it's a challenging one. And for me, I'm always a little nervous in some ways, objectively, about raising issues about my race if it means that I'm just a Chinese guy. Because I'm a realist. I need to carry a room that isn't all Chinese to be selected for parliament or to be selected as a candidate. Which is why I was actually very surprised to be selected last time, because I went to Hampstead and Kilburn. I was the only Chinese guy. I was against a local guy, and I had to win several hundred votes to be selected as their representative. And I did, not because I shied away from my heritage, but because I embraced it. I was like, you know what? I was born on the other side of the world in Hong Kong, and I'm British. What does that tell you about our country? It tells you how incredible our country is, how broad both our diversity, but also our influence. And so if you choose me as your parliamentary candidate, I will embody the values, but also the power of our country, and it's a strength and a weakness. So it's about trying to find the right arguments. And suddenly people are like, holy crap, I resonate with this guy who doesn't look like me more than the other guy. And that's what we need to do, not just in politics, but in terms of the media, in terms of comedy, in terms of all our industries. We got to break our stereotypes and be visible. So even if I never make it into parliament, I'm hopeful that people see me and go, okay, you know what? He's kind of put a step on the ladder, and hopefully the next generation can kind of climb that ladder again. So it's a long-term journey. But yeah, I'm hopeful actually of the future.
Gosh, that's very inspirational. That's quite admirable.
Thank you.
Earlier you mentioned that you're trying to sort of drop that hint of an American accent. Is that so that you kind of fit in a bit more, or like why is that?
Yeah, well, it's partly the fitting in. It's partly because I don't feel like that is a representation of who I am. I was basically taught in an American military base in Germany because it was the only place to learn English at the time. And I just don't feel like it's a fair reflection of who I am. I don't want to talk to someone that has never met me and go, oh, right, you sound like a foreigner. And there's like, oh gosh, I'm already facing the challenge of being seen as the other because of my looks. But then to have another layer on top of that maybe I'm American or something like that. Like it's another layer that I don't necessarily need. Just to be sure, I'm not actively coaching myself to remove the accent. I just think the accent is dulled over time as I live here for longer. I also think that the Chinese voice box tends to be a little bit more nasal anyway. So there's also the biological side where like naturally I might sound a little bit more North Atlantic than normal. So that's just who I am. But there's a lot of people who are now having different accents that have been elected in parliament or whatever. So I don't want to hang on it too much. I'm just going to be me. When I was younger, I think it was a bigger deal, especially at school. But now it's a little better, thankfully.
Whereabouts in the UK did you grow up?
So I grew up in a place called Milton Keynes, which is just 45 minutes from London. It's the land of the roundabouts. Right. But I went to school in Bedford, which is next to Milton Keynes. And I rode in Bedford Modern School. Great school.
But you lived in the UK, but you were born in Hong Kong, right? If I'm correct.
Yes, that's right. So I was born in Hong Kong. I lived there for just 1 month. And then I moved to Holland for several years, and then Germany for 1 year to go to international school. My dad worked in a kind of electronics company, and he headed up kind of Europe. So that's why we bounced along a bit. And then we ended up in the UK. I found it quite challenging to move, to be honest, when I was younger. And I think that partly made me feel a bit angsty about my heritage because I didn't have a root. Now I have a root, but at the time it was hard to make lots of friends and then have it teared away from you. It's quite challenging as a kid, I think.
And you mentioned you couldn't speak English before the age of 9. What languages were you speaking growing up?
Yeah, so I spoke Cantonese, Mandarin, Dutch, and then a bit of German. I confess my Dutch is kind of amalgamated with German because they're quite similar languages. And then my German has since deteriorated a bit as well. So not a massive linguist, but yeah. There's a culture of speaking different languages in Europe. You look at Switzerland, like everybody speaks like 3-4 languages. It's just the way to do it. But a lot of people in Europe speak English because English is the international language. So I suppose if we're British and we happen to have the global language, then I can understand why English is just good enough. I'm just trying to hold on to my Cantonese and Mandarin at the moment, which in itself is a challenge.
When do you get to practice your Cantonese and Mandarin? Like, do you speak it to your partner or?
Yeah, so my partner does speak Cantonese and Mandarin. She's learning Mandarin with weekly lessons, but I confess we mainly speak English, which is terrible. I mean, we're both in, I suppose, the same kind of background that we're Chinese, but we've grown up Western. I do speak Cantonese and Mandarin with my parents as well. I actually speak English mainly with my dad because my dad also grew up partly in the UK. Because the Chinese population in the UK is relatively new, I think. I don't feel like first or second. I feel almost like, because my dad was also British Chinese, I feel like my heritage of the UK is actually longer than the average British Chinese, because he also speaks English in a perfectly British accent. While a lot of my friends who are British Chinese have parents who speak very Chinesey English, right? My mom does the Chinese English thing, but I find I get a perspective of both. So I feel more westernized, I would say, than a lot of people in my peer group. Yeah, but that also means it's easy to let go of my Chinese. So I need to hold on to that. And I value that more as I get older, the importance of being multilingual.
Did you find growing up connecting with your father, because he's British, was easier?
Yeah, I think so. My parents are actually very progressive. So my dad worked very hard in my first 10 years of my life. And then my mom took care of me as the main kind of, what do you call it, like a housewife. And then when I turned 10, my mom and dad swapped over. So my mom would work full time and my dad would take care of me. So I think that's a really progressive thing at the time, right? Especially for Chinese people. And this was 20 years ago. So that meant that I could spend a lot of time with my dad. And that's quite special for me. So I think I have a good balanced relationship with both parents. And I guess in some ways I connect with my dad on my heritage stuff. But in some ways, I don't know if he's faced the things that I faced, because my dad's relatively shy compared to me. I'm still trying to build my career, and I'm interested in building a career in politics as well. So I have to kind of be out there more. And I'm still getting the hits occasionally, but yeah, it's fine. I think the UK is becoming more accepting all the time, but it's up to us, including everyone in this call, to push for that agenda.
Okay, so that's actually quite interesting what you said about your parents switching roles when you were 10. That's not a technique I've heard of before, so that's actually quite intriguing. And obviously it worked because, like you said, you've got quite a balanced relationship with both of your parents. But moving on to the other big part of your life, which is rowing. So last weekend you participated in an indoor rowing competition, right? So how did you get into rowing and start getting into stuff like that?
Definitely. So rowing for me is inherently part of my identity, and it's part of my lived experience when I was younger. So I grew up in a Western world all my life. My mom's from Taiwan, my dad's from Hong Kong. And I've always felt very inadequate, right? I was one of the very few people who was East Asian. I followed a lot of the stereotypes, right? I looked Chinese, I am Chinese, I have glasses. I'm at the time quite skinny, quite nerdy, quite geeky, quite shy. And I accidentally fell into rowing for a number of reasons. The first was because I was bad at every other sport. I had bad hand-eye coordination for like rugby. I tried out for the cricket team and they told me I sucked. I played water polo and they put me in goal. And I was, without glasses, I can't see anything. So I kept getting people would throw balls and hit me in the face because I couldn't see it.
Oh, man.
But I saved the goal, but with my face, which is a terrible way. I mean, that's why that's my fear of why I have a flat face. Right? It's not because I'm Chinese, because of all the balls I've saved. So rowing fell into it. And also the second reason was because I wrote, you had a form you had to fill in. I put R, and I thought R meant rugby because that's the only thing I knew at the time. But it was R for rowing. So then before I knew it, I was in a bus to a rowing center. And so this was in year 9. So when I was like 13, and I basically sucked at rowing for like 3 years. So the first 3 years, I lost everything. I didn't win anything. I was really just a real hindrance, but I stuck to it. And I got my growth spurt, thank God. And just through attrition, because a lot of people, you have to train quite hard. We trained 6 days a week at school, and it could be 4 hours a day. So we would wake up at 5 a.m., train in the morning, train at lunchtime, and then train after school.
Gosh.
And so, I mean, it's great if you have parents that need longer childcare, right? But otherwise, it's very, very tough. And my dad had to drive me around a lot in the mornings, which is pretty brutal for him. So big shout out to him. So we had to really, really focus. And so a lot of people dropped out, but I kind of stuck at it because to me, it was like a family. And in 2008, so when I was in year 12, we rowed in the national championships. I was the captain. So again, from someone that was really shy, to be given a position of authority was really a big morale booster and a confidence booster. But I messed up anyway, because in 2008, we sank in the British Championships because we hit a wave. But there was a fairy tale story in 2009. We managed to win the title. So I was one of the first British Chinese people to win a rowing title. And rowing can be seen as a very undiverse sport. I don't know if you've ever seen like Henley Row Regatta or the Oxford-Cambridge boat race. It's a very elitist sport, frankly. A lot of people are from independent schools. I then went to Durham, which is again quite a posh university where they do a lot of rowing. So I carried on rowing at university for a bit. I decided to become a lightweight rower. So that means losing my weight to 75 kilos. But I found I lost the love of the sport for a bit because of back injuries, etc. And then tried again in 2015 and 2016 to win the indoor national titles. In 2015, I came third and then I got disqualified because I was overweight. I was just a little bit over the weight limit. Thankfully, it didn't trigger like an eating disorder, but I did feel very like embarrassed because it was on the big screen in the London Stadium, right? So there was a lot of people, like 5,000 people watching me fail my weight.
Oh gosh.
And then the next year, I trained very hard, got underweight, got silver in the Welsh Championships, but I came fifth in the British Championships. And I was like, screw this, I'm out of this sport. I'm going to focus on my career. But because of the pandemic, I've kind of decided to kind of jump on it again and try my luck. And so hence I'm rowing a lot now. And I'm rowing because it's not just good for your health, but for me, it's like a sense of familiarity in a world where there's so little certainty.
Were there any issues or conflicts in the rowing team because of your race, because of your culture, of who you are, a British Chinese?
That's an interesting question. I think for me, honestly, no. At least at school level, partly because I was given the authority really early. So that was a real shock because I was given captaincy when I was 16, when there was people in year 13. I was in year 12. And I guess there was tension there from the older rowers, right? But I think the tension wasn't necessarily because of my race, but because of, just the fact that like they wanted the position. And that's totally understandable. I would feel the same way. But the beauty of sport is that you measure it through your performance and how hard you work. I was one of the smallest people in the rowing team. I was 6 foot, but I was one of the lightest people in the crew. The average, like the top rowers in our team would be 6'4". They'd weigh 20, 30 kilos more than me. And a lot of them in my crew, I rowed for Great Britain. Like we were a very elite team. But I survived and stayed in the top boat because I worked my guts off. I worked my life. I focused more on my rowing than on my studies. It was my life. The headmaster actually intervened and said, Johnny, I think you need to tone down the rowing and focus on your A levels. I think there's probably some lobbying from my mom, actually. And I said, like, anyone can get A levels, but how many people are going to win a national title in rowing? Like, to me, it's like, don't let the institution crush you kind of thing. And I think if people see that you work really hard, then there is respect. I think it's a little different if you're trying to join a different organization for the first time and first impressions count. And especially if it's not in sport. I love sport in a way because it's like, how fast do you row? How fast do you perform? And it doesn't matter what background you are. It's beautiful. And I wish life was as clear in some ways as sport. But no, I've had a good time.
Is there anything you'd like to shout out to or, as a final remark?
Yeah, just to say that I don't really mind in terms of politics, which political party, etc. From any background, I think more people need to engage. And so that would be awesome. If you do want to engage with kind of the side I'm on, then do check out Consider Friends of Chinese. Or if you want to just talk about policy and things or rowing, feel free to find me on social media, on Instagram, Twitter, Johnny Luk, _LUK.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
Good luck on the podcast. I think this podcast is really needed. So the more voices, and not just on Chinese issues, right? Just broader issues. I think it's so useful.
Yeah.
So good on you guys. And I look forward to listening to it.
Thank you so much. So that's the end of episode 5. I really enjoyed that. It was a really interesting talk. And we're really glad to have gained another friend and supporter after this episode. Anthony, what did you think?
Yeah, it was the first time ever I've heard of an East Asian family where they switched parental roles. So at the age of 10, Johnny said that his father became the primary carer. And I think that's an incredibly admirable thing to do. There seems to be more equality in that, where you get to have both of your parents take care of you in equal measure. It must have been quite nice, to not have your dad constantly working, especially in Johnny's case. His dad was in a busy role overseeing European affairs, but to be able to spend quality time with him in your formative years, that sounds really nice. And there's also a very small part of me that wants to talk to Johnny's dad and learn more about his side of the story too.
Yeah, that part really intrigued me actually, and not gonna lie, it might even be a technique that I would want to try implementing if and when I have kids, because it does seem like an equal solution, so that both parents can spend equal amounts of time with the kid. But obviously that entirely depends on my salary, so we'll see about
exactly. I mean, I wouldn't mind trying it too. It might be quite nice to spend time with your children whilst they're still young, you know? It was also very enlightening for me, especially when Johnny clarified the definition of politics, in that you have to be in it to solve problems, real life problems, and avoid focusing on putting labels on yourself and other people as, you know, conservative, Labour, Lib Dem. I mean, putting labels doesn't really do anything except, you know, divide each other, group each other into different tribes, let's say. And I think his idea of politics has more of a sense of pragmatism, more hands-on, more active role, which I find incredibly inspiring.
Yeah, I liked his definition for politics because that's something that I actually really agreed with. Politics should be more about wanting to solve problems and how to go about that. And I think it's rather unhelpful to have these preset labels that people put themselves into. Because personally, sometimes I will agree with certain policies of one party, and then but also disagree with other policies of the same party. So, like, I think it is like a fluid thing rather than such a set label with politics. But yeah, it was really refreshing to meet someone who was moderately right wing, but still an avid supporter of LGBT rights and just equality in general. Because I think at best, most of the right wing people that I've met are indifferent to LGBT people. But it was really nice to hear that he was like a massive fighter for these groups.
Yeah, I think that just really shows how open-minded Johnny is, and he's a guy who's willing to listen to diverse opinions. In my personal view, I don't think you can be a good problem solver if you don't listen to everyone.
Yeah, the more different perspectives, the better. But yeah, if you like this episode, please let us know on our social media. It really gives us motivation when we see all your comments. But actually, if you didn't like it, let us know all the same. Like I said, the more perspectives, the better. We're still a relatively new podcast, and we're constantly looking for new ways to improve. But yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next time.